I used to think my brother Tim had the perfect life. A great job, a cozy house in the suburbs, and a wife, Claire, who could light up a room just by walking into it. Claire was the kind of woman who seemed untouchable, smart, charming, and beautiful in that classic way that made you feel like she was out of everyone's league, including Tim's. But they worked, you know? At least, that's what I thought. I was a part-time guest in their lives. Being Tim's half-brother, I'd often crash at their place when work brought me to their city. We weren't close as kids, we only met when I was 16, but we became tight in adulthood. I admired him, envied him even. He had what I imagined was the American dream, and I believed Claire was the crown jewel of it all. Until one night, when everything came crashing down. It started innocently enough. I was over for dinner, a casual affair since Tim had just landed a promotion and wanted to celebrate. Claire had cooked up one of her specialties, a roast chicken with herbs, and we were all smiles around the table. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way Claire barely made eye contact with Tim. Or the way her phone buzzed relentlessly, and she'd sneak glances at the screen, trying to hide a smirk. I didn't think much of it, everyone's married life has quirks. But then I went to grab another beer from the fridge, and I saw it. Her phone was on the counter, unlocked, the screen lit up with a notification. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the words leaped out at me. "Can't stop thinking about last night. You're incredible." My stomach dropped. The sender's name was saved as Julia, but something about it screamed wrong. Claire wasn't close to anyone named Julia, and this message didn't sound like girl talk. I grabbed my beer and sat back down, the words bouncing around my head. I wanted to believe it was innocent, that it was a misunderstanding, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. That night, after Tim and Claire went to bed, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. The thought of confronting Tim about what I saw felt impossible. If I was wrong, it could blow up their marriage for no reason. If I was right, well, I didn't want to think about that. A week later, Tim called me out of the blue. His voice was unusually heavy, like he was carrying the weight of the world. "Hey, can we talk?" he asked. "Of course. What's up?" I tried to keep my tone light, masking the dread building in my chest. "I think Claire's hiding something from me. I don't know, it's just little things, you know? She's been working late a lot. Her phone's always glued to her hand. And the other day, I found a receipt for a hotel room in her car. She said it was for a friend's bachelorette party, but..." He trailed off. I clenched the phone tightly, unsure of what to say. Should I tell him about the text I saw? Would that make things worse? "Tim," I said carefully, "do you think she could be?" "No." He cut me off, almost too quickly. "I mean, Claire would never. We've been married for 6 years. We've been through so much together. I don't know. Maybe I'm being paranoid." "You're not crazy for having doubts," I said, choosing my words cautiously. "Sometimes it's better to trust your instincts. Maybe just keep an eye out. Look for patterns." He sighed heavily. "Yeah, maybe you're right." When we hung up, I felt a strange mix of guilt and responsibility. Tim wasn't just my brother, he was a good man who didn't deserve this. If Claire really was cheating, it would destroy him. Over the next few weeks, Tim and I stayed in touch more than usual. He didn't bring up Claire again, but I could tell the doubts were eating at him. One night, he called me after midnight, sounding drunk. "She's hiding something," he slurred. "I know it. But I can't prove it." "Tim, don't do anything rash," I said. "If you really think she's cheating, you need proof. Otherwise, it's just your word against hers." The line went quiet for a moment. Then, he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "I think I need your help." Tim wasn't the kind of guy to play detective. He was a straight shooter, the kind of man who believed honesty could fix anything. But now, doubt had him tangled in knots, and it was eating him alive. When he asked for my help, I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to betray Claire's trust if it turned out there was an innocent explanation. But the look in Tim's eyes when we met at his place the next day told me he wasn't going to drop this until he had answers. "She's going out tonight," he said as he poured 2 cups of coffee. His hand was shaking. "She told me it's a work dinner, but I don't buy it. I need to know where she's going." I stared at him, unsure if this was the right call. "Are you sure you want to go down this road? Once you start looking, there's no going back." He gave me a hard look. "I need to know." So, we hatched a plan. Tim would install a GPS tracking app on Claire's phone. It was simple, just a quick download while she was in the shower. I felt uneasy as we went through with it, like we were crossing some line we couldn't uncross. But Tim's desperation was contagious, and I couldn't stand to see my brother like this. That night, Claire left the house wearing a black dress that hugged her curves. She looked stunning, but Tim barely glanced at her. His jaw was clenched as she kissed him goodbye, and I could see the tension radiating off him. The second she was out the door, we opened the tracking app. "Let's see where she goes," Tim said, his voice tight. We watched as the little dot on the screen moved across town. At first, it seemed like she was heading toward a restaurant, and I started to think maybe we were wrong. But then the dot stopped at a hotel. Tim's face went pale. "A hotel?" he whispered. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him it could still be innocent. Maybe she was meeting a client, or a friend. But the look on his face told me he wasn't buying it. "We're going there," he said, grabbing his keys. The drive to the hotel was tense. Tim barely spoke, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I tried to think of something comforting to say, but nothing felt right. This was his worst nightmare, and we were heading straight into it. When we arrived, Tim parked in the far corner of the lot. "Stay here," he said, his voice cold. I watched as he walked toward the entrance, his shoulders stiff with determination. Part of me wanted to go with him, to be there in case things got ugly. But I knew he needed to do this alone. Minutes crawled by. I sat in the car, my stomach churning, until finally Tim emerged. His face was a mask of fury and heartbreak. "She's here," he said, his voice trembling. "Room 217. I saw her walk in with some guy." "Tim, maybe we should leave," I said cautiously. "You don't want to do something you'll regret." But he shook his head. "No. I'm not letting her get away with this." I followed him back to the hotel, unsure of what he planned to do. When we reached the second floor, he stood outside room 217 for a moment, his fist poised to knock. But then he stopped, pulling out his phone instead. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "Getting proof," he said. He crouched down and slid his phone under the door, angling it to capture the sounds and shadows inside. The faint sound of laughter and murmured voices reached us, and Tim's face darkened. After a few minutes, he pulled the phone back and stood. "That's all I needed." We left the hotel in silence, and I could feel the storm brewing inside him. Whatever Tim had planned next, I knew it wouldn't end well. Back at his house, Tim replayed the audio from the phone. I sat across the room, feeling like an intruder on something deeply personal and devastating. Claire's voice was unmistakable, soft, laughing, flirty. And then came the man's voice, low and smooth, like a dagger sliding into Tim's heart. Tim shut the recording off abruptly, his face a mask of rage. "That's all I need," he said through gritted teeth. "What are you going to do?" I asked cautiously. He didn't answer at first. He just stared at the phone, his knuckles white around it. Then, he looked up at me with a calmness that made my stomach twist. "She thinks she's so clever, sneaking around like this. But she doesn't know who she's dealing with. I'm going to make sure she never forgets what she did." "Tim," I said, leaning forward, "revenge isn't going to fix this. It'll just make things messier." But he wasn't listening. He was already planning something, the wheels in his head turning at full speed. Over the next few days, Tim threw himself into his plan. He didn't confront Claire, didn't even hint that he knew about the affair. Instead, he played the doting husband, cooking dinner, complimenting her outfits, and even suggesting a weekend getaway to rekindle the romance. Claire seemed to eat it up. She smiled more, laughed at his jokes, and acted like everything was normal. But I could see through it. The way her phone was never out of arm's reach, the way she flinched whenever Tim got too close. She was hiding something, and she knew it. One evening, Tim called me over after Claire had gone to bed. He had a laptop open on the kitchen table, his face illuminated by the screen. "What's this?" I asked. He turned the laptop toward me, revealing a series of photos and screenshots. Text messages between Claire and her lover, credit card statements showing charges at hotels, and even a candid photo of them together outside a restaurant. "I hired a private investigator," Tim said, his voice cold. "I wanted proof. Now I've got it." My stomach sank as I scrolled through the evidence. There was no denying it, Claire was cheating. But what disturbed me more was the intensity in Tim's eyes. "This is what I'm going to show her," he said, tapping the screen. "But not yet. First, I'm going to make her feel comfortable, let her think everything's fine. And then, I'll pull the rug out from under her. Tim, are you sure about this? Maybe it's better to just end things cleanly." He shook his head. "No. She needs to understand what she's done. And he does too." That Friday, Tim whisked Claire away to a lakeside cabin they'd rented for the weekend. He played the role of the loving husband to perfection, packing her favorite snacks, planning romantic walks, and even bringing a bottle of her favorite wine. I stayed behind, feeling uneasy about what might happen. Tim had told me he had a plan, but he refused to share the details. "You'll find out soon enough," he'd said with a cryptic smile. On Saturday evening, I got a text from him. "It's done. Come by tomorrow morning." When I arrived at the cabin the next day, Tim was sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked calm, almost serene. "What happened?" I asked, my heart pounding. He gestured for me to sit. "Last night, after dinner, I showed her everything. The texts, the photos, the receipts. She tried to deny it at first, but there was no way out. She broke down, crying, begging me not to leave her." "What did you say?" "I told her I'd think about it," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "But first, I wanted to know why she did it." "And?" Tim leaned back in his chair, staring out at the lake. "She said she felt neglected. That I was too focused on work and not enough on her. Typical excuses. But you know what the kicker was?" "What?" "She said it didn't mean anything. That it was just physical. Like that's supposed to make it better." As Tim and I sat on the porch, a car pulled up the driveway. My stomach sank when I saw who it was. Claire. She got out of the car, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Tim," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." Tim didn't move. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. "There's nothing to talk about," he said finally. "You made your choices, Claire. Now you have to live with them." "Please," she said, stepping closer. "I'll do anything. Just don't leave me." I felt like an intruder, caught in the middle of something I had no business witnessing. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Tim stood, his posture stiff. "I gave you everything, Claire. And you threw it away. Do you know what that feels like?" "I was stupid," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake. But I love you, Tim. I always have." For a moment, I thought he might forgive her. The pain in his eyes was raw, but there was also a flicker of something else. Hope, maybe. But then he shook his head. "You don't get to say that anymore." He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving Claire standing there, her shoulders shaking with sobs. After Claire left, I sat with Tim in the living room, unsure of what to say. He was staring at the fireplace, his jaw tight, the muscles in his face twitching as if holding back an eruption. "She didn't leave," he said suddenly. "She's still out there." I peeked through the window. Sure enough, Claire's car was still in the driveway. She was sitting inside, motionless, as though paralyzed by what had just transpired. "What are you going to do?" I asked hesitantly. Tim's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Let her stew," She deserves it. We sat in silence for a few moments before he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Do you think she's really sorry? I wasn't sure how to answer. I think she's sorry she got caught. He nodded, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. That's what I thought too. 2 days after the cabin incident, Tim called me with an idea that sent a chill down my spine. I'm going to confront the guy, he said. What? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. Tim, that's a terrible idea. You don't know how he's going to react. I don't care, he said, his tone icy. He needs to know I'm not someone to mess with. And he needs to understand what kind of person Claire really is. I tried to talk him out of it, but Tim was adamant. He'd already looked up the guy's address using information from the private investigator. His name was Eric, and he lived in a trendy apartment complex downtown. I'm not going there to fight, Tim assured me. I just want to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go with him. I couldn't let him do this alone, and if things got out of hand, I wanted to be there to pull him back. When we arrived at Eric's building, Tim's face was a mask of determination. He knocked on the door, and a moment later, it opened to reveal a man in his mid-30s with an athletic build and an easygoing smile. The smile vanished when he saw Tim. Eric, Tim said, his voice steady. We need to talk. Eric glanced between us, clearly trying to decide whether to slam the door or let us in. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. The apartment was minimalist and sleek, the kind of place you'd expect from someone who spent more time at the gym than at home. I stood near the door, ready to intervene if necessary, while Tim sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly. You know who I am, Tim said. Eric nodded slowly. Yeah. Claire's husband. Tim let out a bitter laugh. That's right. Claire's husband. The guy she lied to while she was sleeping with you. Eric shifted uncomfortably. Look, man, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Claire told me you two were having problems. Don't, Tim interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't you dare try to justify this. Eric held up his hands defensively. I'm not. I'm just saying. I didn't know it would blow up like this. Tim leaned forward, his eyes blazing. You didn't know? You didn't know that sleeping with a married woman might cause problems? Are you really that stupid? The room was thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse racing. But then Tim did something I didn't expect. He stood up, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small envelope. Here, he said, tossing it onto the coffee table. Eric frowned. What's this? Proof, Tim said. Proof of what kind of person Claire is. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. Eric opened the envelope and pulled out the photos and screenshots Tim had collected. His face paled as he looked through them. I don't want revenge, Tim said. I just want you to know the truth. She's not who you think she is. Eric didn't say anything. He just stared at the photos, his expression a mix of shock and regret. Tim turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back. One more thing, he said. If I ever see you near my wife again, you'll regret it. After confronting Eric, Tim seemed calmer, almost relieved. But I could tell he wasn't done yet. There was still a fire burning inside him, and I had a feeling it wouldn't go out until he finished whatever he'd started. I've been thinking, he said one evening as we sat on his porch. Claire doesn't deserve to get away with this. But I'm not going to stoop to her level. What does that mean? I asked, wary of his tone. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. You'll see. Over the next few weeks, Tim transformed into a man with a mission. He kept up the charade of normalcy, acting as though he was willing to work things out with Claire. It was unsettling to watch, how he would smile and laugh with her, even as I knew he was planning something bigger in the background. She thinks I'm coming around, Tim said to me one afternoon as we sat in his garage. She's trying so hard now. Cooking my favorite meals, planning date nights. It's almost pathetic. And you're just playing along? I asked, my unease growing. Why not? He said with a shrug. She played me for months, maybe years. Now it's my turn. It was hard to argue with his logic, but something about his tone made me worry. This wasn't the Tim I knew. He was colder, more calculating. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was planning, it wasn't going to end well for anyone involved. Claire had planned a special evening for their upcoming wedding anniversary, a last-ditch effort to win Tim back. She rented a private dining room at an upscale restaurant and spared no expense on the details. Tim, ever the actor, played his part to perfection. He complimented her dress, held her hand, and even brought a bouquet of her favorite flowers. The private room was dimly lit, with a small table set for two. A bottle of champagne chilled in a silver bucket, and soft music played in the background. It was the kind of setting that might have rekindled a fading romance, if the romance hadn't already been reduced to ashes. As the waiters served their main courses, Claire reached across the table and took Tim's hand. "I just want to say thank you," she said softly, "for giving us another chance. I know I messed up, but I'm going to do everything I can to make it right." Tim smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something Claire didn't seem to notice. "I appreciate that," he said. "But there's something I need to tell you." Claire's smile faltered. "What is it?" Tim leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "This isn't working." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with panic. "I mean," Tim said, his voice calm and measured, "that I've been lying to you. Just like you lied to me." Claire's face went pale. "Tim, No," he interrupted. "You don't get to explain. I already know everything." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, setting it on the table between them. "This is for you. It's everything I've collected, the texts, the photos, the recordings. Consider it a little souvenir." Claire stared at the USB drive, her hands trembling. "Tim, please. Let's not do this here." "Oh, we're doing this here," Tim said, his voice rising slightly. "You think I'd let you humiliate me and just walk away? No. You're going to hear what I have to say." The door to the private room opened, and I stepped in, holding a stack of envelopes. Claire looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tim smirked. "These are for your friends, your family, and your coworkers. Consider it my gift to you. The truth, wrapped up in a neat little package." I handed Tim the envelopes, and he began placing them in a bag. Claire reached out to stop him, but he brushed her hand away. "You had your fun," he said coldly. "Now it's my turn." The next morning, the fallout began. Claire's phone rang incessantly as the recipients of Tim's letters began calling to express their shock and disgust. Her parents were furious, her friends were distant, and her coworkers suddenly had 100 reasons to avoid her. She called Tim repeatedly, but he didn't answer. Instead, he spent the day with me, watching the chaos unfold from a distance. "You really went through with it?" I said, half in awe and half in disbelief. "Damn right I did," Tim said, sipping his coffee. "She deserves every bit of this." But as the hours went by, I noticed something shifting in him. The satisfaction he'd felt earlier seemed to fade, replaced by a deep weariness. "Do you think it's enough?" I asked carefully. He didn't answer right away. Then, after a long silence, he said, "I don't know." Weeks later, Tim received a letter in the mail. It was from Claire, and it was unlike anything we'd expected. She apologized, of course, but she didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she explained why she'd done what she did, not as an excuse, but as a way to give Tim closure. She admitted she'd been unhappy for years, feeling neglected and unappreciated, but she also acknowledged that her actions were wrong and selfish. At the end of the letter, she included something unexpected, a check for half of their shared savings, along with a note that read, "You deserve to start over. I hope you find happiness." Tim read the letter in silence, his face unreadable. When he finished, he set it down and looked out the window. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He shook his head. I don't know. Maybe this is enough. And for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of the old Tim, the man who believed in love, even after everything he'd been through.